Chapter 16 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 16. The sun was setting when they reached the wicket gate, at which the path began, and as the rain falls upon the just and unjust alike, it shed its warm tint even upon the resting places of the dead, and bade them be of good hope for its rising on the morrow. The church was old and grey, with ivy clinging to the walls and round the porch. Shunning the tombs, it crept about the mounds, beneath which slept poor humble men, twining for them the first wreaths they had ever won, but wreaths less liable to wither and far more lasting in their kind than some which were graven deep in stone and marble, and told in pompous terms of virtues meekly hidden for many a year, and only revealed at last to executors and mourning legatees. The clergyman's horse, stumbling with a dull blunt sound among the graves, was cropping the grass, at once deriving orthodox consolation from the dead parishioners, and enforcing last Sunday's text that this was what all flesh came to. A lean ass, who had sought to expound it also, without being qualified and ordained, was pricking his ears in an empty pound hard by, and looking with hungry eyes upon his priestly neighbour. The old man and the child quitted the gravel path, and strayed among the tombs, for there the ground was soft and easy to their tired feet. As they passed behind the church, they heard voices near at hand, and presently came on those who had spoken. They were two men, who were seated in easy attitudes upon the grass, and so busily engaged as to be at first unconscious of intruders. It was not difficult to divine that they were of a class of itinerant showmen, exhibitors of the freaks of Punch, for, perched cross-legged upon a tombstone behind them, was a figure of that hero himself, his nose and chin as hooked and his face as beaming as usual. Perhaps his imperturbable character was never more strikingly developed, for he preserved his usual equable smile, notwithstanding that his body was dangling in a most uncomfortable position, all loose and limp and shapeless, while his long peaked cap, unequally balanced against his exceedingly slight legs, threatened every instant to bring him toppling down. In part scattered upon the ground at the feet of the two men, and in part jumbled together in a long flat box, were the other persons of the drama: the hero's wife and one child, the hobby-horse, the doctor, the foreign gentleman who, not being familiar with the language, is unable in the representation to express his ideas otherwise than by utterance of the word shalabala 3 distinct times, the radical neighbour, who will by no means admit that a tin bell is an organ, the executioner, and the devil were all here. Their owners had evidently come to that spot to make some needful repairs on the stage arrangements, for one of them was engaged in binding together a small gallows with thread, while the other was intent upon fixing a new black wig, with the aid of a small hammer and some tacks, upon the head of the radical neighbour who had been beaten bald. They raised their eyes when the old man and his young companion were close upon them, and pausing in their work, returned their looks of curiosity. One of them, the actual exhibitor no doubt, was a little merry-faced man with a twinkling eye and a red nose, who seemed to have unconsciously imbibed something of his hero's character. The other, that was he who took the money, had rather a careful and cautious look, which was perhaps inseparable from his occupation also. The merry man was the first to greet the strangers with a nod, and following the old man's eyes, he observed that perhaps that was the first time he had ever seen a Punch off the stage. Punch, it may be remarked, seemed to be pointing with the tip of his cap to a most flourishing epitaph, and to be chuckling over it with all his heart. "Why do you come here to do this?" said the old man, sitting down beside them, and looking at the figures with extreme delight. "Why, you see," rejoined the little man, "we're putting up for to-night at the public-house yonder, and it wouldn't do to let 'em see the present company undergoing repair." "No?" cried the old man, making signs to Nell to listen. "Why not, eh? Why not?" "Because it would destroy all the delusion, and take away all the interest, wouldn't it?" replied the little man. "Would you care a halfpenny for the Lord Chancellor
if you knowed him in private and without his wig? Certainly not.'
'Good,' said the old man, venturing to touch one of the puppets, and drawing away his hand with a shrill laugh. 'Are you going to show them to-night? Are you?'
'That is the intention, governor,' replied the other, 'and, unless I'm much mistaken, Tommy Codlin is a calculating at this minute what we've lost through your coming upon us. Cheer up, Tommy, it can't be much.' The little man accompanied these latter words with a wink, expressive of the estimate he had formed of the travellers' finances. To this, Mr Codlin, who had a surly, grumbling manner, replied, as he twitched Punch off the tombstone and flung him into the box: 'I don't care if we haven't lost a farden, but you're too free. If you stood in front of the curtain and see the public's faces as I do, you'd know human natur better.' 'Ah, it's been the spoiling of you, Tommy, your taking to that branch,' rejoined his companion. 'When you played the ghost in the regular drama in the fairs, you believed in everything, except ghosts. But now you're a universal mistruster. I never see a man so changed.'
'Never mind,'
said Mr Codlin, with the air of a discontented philosopher. 'I know better now, and perhaps I'm sorry for it.' Turning over the figures in the box like one who knew and despised them, Mr Codlin drew one forth and held it up for the inspection of his friend.
'Look here. Here's all this Judy's clothes falling to pieces again. You haven't got a needle and thread, I suppose?'
The little man shook his head, and scratched it ruefully as he contemplated this severe indisposition of a principal performer. Seeing that they were at a loss, the child said timidly:
'I have a needle, sir, in my basket, and thread too. Will you let me try to mend it for you? I think I could do it neater than you could.'
Even Mr Codlin had nothing to urge against a proposal so seasonable. Nelly, kneeling down beside the box, was soon busily engaged in her task, and accomplishing it to a miracle. While she was thus engaged, the merry little man looked at her with an interest which did not appear to be diminished when he glanced at her helpless companion. When she had finished her work, he thanked her, and inquired whither they were travelling.
'No further to-night, I think,'
said the child, looking towards her grandfather.
'If you're wanting a place to stop at,' the man remarked, 'I should advise you to take up at the same house with us. That's it, the long low white house there. It's very cheap.' The old man, notwithstanding his fatigue, would have remained in the churchyard all night if his new acquaintances had remained there too. As he yielded to this suggestion a ready and rapturous assent, they all rose and walked away together, he keeping close to the box of puppets, in which he was quite absorbed, the merry little man carrying it slung over his arm by a strap attached to it for the purpose, Nelly having hold of her grandfather's hand, and Mr Codlin sauntering slowly behind, casting up at the church tower and neighbouring trees such looks as he was accustomed in town practice to direct to drawing-room and nursery windows, when seeking for a profitable spot on which to plant the show. The public house was kept by a fat old landlord and landlady, who made no objection to receiving their new guests, but praised Nelly's beauty and were at once prepossessed in her behalf. There was no other company in the kitchen but the two showmen, and the child felt very thankful that they had fallen upon such good quarters. The landlady was very much astonished to learn they had come all the way from London, and appeared to have no little curiosity touching their farther destination. The child parried her inquiries as well as she could, and with no great trouble, for finding that they appeared to give her pain, the old lady desisted. 'These two gentlemen have ordered supper in an hour's time,' she said, taking her into the bar, 'and your best plan will be to sup with them. Meanwhile you shall have a little taste of something that'll do you good, for I'm sure you must want it after all you've gone through to-day. Now, don't look after the old gentleman, because when you've drank that, he shall have some too.' As nothing could induce the child to leave him alone, however, or to touch anything in which he was not the first and greatest sharer, the old lady was obliged to help him first.
When they had been thus refreshed, the whole house hurried away into an empty stable, where the show stood, and where, by the light of a few flaring candles stuck round a hoop which hung by a line from the ceiling, it was to be forthwith exhibited. And now Mr Thomas Codlin, the misanthrope, after blowing away at the Pan's pipes until he was intensely wretched, took his station on one side of the checked drapery which concealed the mover of the figures, and putting his hands in his pockets, prepared to reply to all questions and remarks of Punch, and to make a dismal feint of being his most intimate private friend, of believing in him to the fullest and most unlimited extent, of knowing that he enjoyed day and night a merry and glorious existence in that temple, and that he was at all times and under every circumstance the same intelligent and joyful person that the spectators then beheld him. All this Mr Codlin did with the air of a man who had made up his mind for the worst and was quite resigned, his eye slowly wandering about during the briskest repartee to observe the effect upon the audience, and particularly the impression made upon the landlord and landlady, which might be productive of very important results in connection with the supper. Upon this head, however, he had no cause for any anxiety, for the whole performance was applauded to the echo, and voluntary contributions were showered in with a liberality which testified yet more strongly to the general delight. Among the laughter, none was more loud and frequent than the old man's. Nell's was unheard, for she, poor child, with her head drooping on his shoulder, had fallen asleep, and slept too soundly to be roused by any of his efforts to awaken her to a participation in his glee. The supper was very good, but she was too tired to eat, and yet would not leave the old man until she had kissed him in his bed. He, happily insensible to every care and anxiety, sat listening with a vacant smile and admiring face to all that his new friend said, and it was not until they retired yawning to their room that he followed the child upstairs. It was but a loft partitioned into 2 compartments, where they were to rest, but they were well pleased with their lodging and had hoped for none so good. The old man was uneasy when he had lain down, and begged that Nell would come and sit at his bedside, as she had done for so many nights. She hastened to him, and sat there till he slept. There was a little window, hardly more than a chink in the wall, in her room, and when she left him she opened it, quite wondering at the silence. The sight of the old church, and the graves about it in the moonlight, and the dark trees whispering among themselves, made her more thoughtful than before. She closed the window again, and sitting down upon the bed thought of the life that was before them. She had a little money, but it was very little, and when that was gone they must begin to beg. There was 1 piece of gold among it, and an emergency might come when its worth to them would be increased 100-fold. It would be best to hide this coin, and never produce it unless their case was absolutely desperate, and no other resource was left them. Her resolution taken, she sewed the piece of gold into her dress, and going to bed with a lighter heart, sunk into a deep slumber. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17. Another bright day shining in through the small casement, and claiming fellowship with the kindred eyes of the child, awoke her. At sight of the strange room and its unaccustomed objects, she started up in alarm, wondering how she had been moved from the familiar chamber in which she seemed to have fallen asleep last night, and whither she had been conveyed. But, another glance around called to her mind all that had lately passed, and she sprung from her bed, hoping and trustful. It was yet early, and the old man being still asleep, she walked out into the churchyard, brushing the dew from the long grass with her feet, and often turning aside into places where it grew longer than in others, that she might not tread upon the graves. She felt a curious kind of pleasure in lingering among these houses of the dead, and read the inscriptions on the tombs of the good people, A great number of good people were buried there, passing on from one to another with increasing interest. It was a very quiet place, as such a place should be, save for the cawing of the rooks, who had built their nests among the branches of some tall old trees, and were calling to one another high up in the air. First, one sleek bird, hovering near his ragged house as it swung and dangled in the wind, uttered his hoarse cry, quite by chance as it would seem, and in a sober tone as though he were but talking to himself. Another answered, and he called again, but louder than before. Then another spoke, and then another, and each time the first, aggravated by contradiction, insisted on his case more strongly. Other voices, silent till now, struck in from boughs lower down, and higher up, and midway, and to the right and left, and from the tree-tops, and others arriving hastily from the grey church turrets and old belfry window, joined the clamour, which rose and fell, and swelled and dropped again, and still went on. And all this noisy contention, amidst a skimming to and fro, and lighting on fresh branches, and frequent change of place, which satirized the old restlessness of those who lay so still beneath the moss and turf below, and the strife in which they had worn away their lives. Frequently raising her eyes to the trees whence these sounds came down, and feeling as though they made the place more quiet than perfect silence would have done, the child loitered from grave to grave, now stopping to replace with careful hands the bramble which had started from some green mound it helped to keep in shape, and now peeping through one of the low latticed windows into the church, with its worm-eaten books upon the desks, and bays of white and green mouldering from the pew sides, and leaving the naked wood to view. There were the seats where the poor old people sat, worn spare and yellow like themselves, the rugged font where children had their names, the homely altar where they knelt in after life, the plain black trestles that bore their weight on their last visit to the cool old shady church. Everything told of long use and quiet slow decay. The very bell-rope in the porch was frayed into a fringe, and hoary with old age. She was looking at a humble stone which told of a young man who had died at 23 years old, 55 years ago, when she heard a faltering step approaching, and looking round saw a feeble woman bent with the weight of years, who tottered to the foot of that same grave and asked her to read the writing on the stone. The old woman thanked her when she had done, saying that she had had the words by heart for many a long, long year, but could not see them now.
"Were you his mother?"
said the child.
"I was his wife, my dear."
She the wife of a young man of 23? Ah, true, it was 55 years ago.
"You wonder to hear me say that?" remarked the old woman, shaking her head. "You're not the first. Older folk than you have wondered at the same thing before now. Yes, I was his wife. Death doesn't change us more than life, my dear."
"Do you come here often?"
asked the child.
"I sit here very often in the summer time," she answered. "I used to come here once to cry and mourn, but that was a weary while ago, bless God. I pluck the daisies as they grow, and take them home," said the old woman after a short silence. "I like no flowers so well as these, and haven't for 55 years. It's a long time, and I'm getting very old."
Then growing garrulous upon a theme which was new to one listener, though it were but a child, she told her how she had wept and moaned and prayed to die herself when this happened, and how when she first came to that place, a young creature strong in love and grief, she had hoped that her heart was breaking, as it seemed to be. But that time passed by, and although she continued to be sad when she came there, still she could bear to come, and so went on until it was pain no longer, but a solemn pleasure, and a duty she had learned to like. And now that 55 years were gone, she spoke of the dead man as if he had been her son or grandson, with a kind of pity for his youth, growing out of her own old age, and an exalting of his strength and manly beauty as compared with her own weakness and decay. And yet she spoke about him as her husband too, and thinking of herself in connection with him, as she used to be, and not as she was now, talked of their meeting in another world, as if he were dead but yesterday, and she, separated from her former self, were thinking of the happiness of that comely girl who seemed to have died with him. The child left her gathering the flowers that grew upon the grave, and thoughtfully retraced her steps. The old man was by this time up and dressed. Mr Codlin, still doomed to contemplate the harsh realities of existence, was packing among his linen the candle ends which had been saved from the previous night's performance, while his companion received the compliments of all the loungers in the stable yard, who, unable to separate him from the master mind of Punch, set him down as next in importance to that merry outlaw, and loved him scarcely less. When he had sufficiently acknowledged his popularity, he came in to breakfast, at which meal they all sat down together.
'And where are you going to-day?' said the little man, addressing himself to Nell.
'Indeed, I hardly know. We have not determined yet,'
replied the child.
'We're going on to the races,' said the little man. 'If that's your way, and you like to have us for company, let us travel together. If you prefer going alone, only say the word, and you'll find that we shan't trouble you.'
'We'll go with you,' said the old man. 'Nell, with them, with them.'
The child considered for a moment, and reflecting that she must shortly beg, and could scarcely hope to do so at a better place than where crowds of rich ladies and gentlemen were assembled together for purposes of enjoyment and festivity, determined to accompany these men so far. She therefore thanked the little man for his offer, and said, glancing timidly towards his friend, that if there was no objection to their accompanying them as far as the race town—
'Objection?' said the little man. 'Now be gracious for once, Tommy, and say that you'd rather they went with us. I know you would. Be gracious, Tommy.'
'Trotters,' said Mr Codlin, who talked very slowly and ate very greedily, as is not uncommon with philosophers and misanthropes,
'you're too free.' 'Why, what harm can it do?' urged the other. 'No harm at all in this particular case, perhaps,' replied Mr Codlin, 'but the principle's a dangerous one, and you're too free, I tell you.' 'Well, are they to go with us or not?'
'Yes, they are,' said Mr Codlin.
'But you might have made a favour of it, mightn't you?'
The real name of the little man was Harris, but it had gradually merged into the less euphonious one of Trotters, which, with the prefatory adjective, short, had been conferred upon him by reason of the small size of his legs. Short Trotters, however, being a compound name, inconvenient of use in friendly dialogue, the gentleman on whom it had been bestowed was known among his intimates either as Short or Trotters, and was seldom accosted at full length as Short Trotters, except in formal conversations and on occasions of ceremony. Short then, or Trotters, as the reader pleases, returned unto the remonstrance of his friend Mr Thomas Codlin, a jocose answer calculated to turn aside his discontent, and applying himself with great relish to the cold boiled beef, the tea, and bread and butter, strongly impressed upon his companions that they should do the like. Mr Codlin indeed required no such persuasion, as he had already eaten as much as he could possibly carry, and was now moistening his clay with strong ale, whereof he took deep draughts with a silent relish, and invited nobody to partake, thus again strongly indicating his misanthropical turn of mind. Breakfast being at length over, Mr Codlin called the bill, and charging the ale to the company generally, a practice also savouring of misanthropy, divided the sum total into 2 fair and equal parts, assigning one moiety to himself and friend, and the other to Nelly and her grandfather. These being duly discharged, and all things ready for their departure, they took farewell of the landlord and landlady, and resumed their journey. And here Mr Codlin's false position in society, and the effect it wrought upon his wounded spirit, were strongly illustrated. For whereas he had been last night accosted by Mr Punch as master, and had by inference left the audience to understand that he maintained that individual for his own luxurious entertainment and delight, here he was now painfully walking beneath the burden of that same Punch's temple, and bearing it bodily upon his shoulders on a sultry day and along a dusty road. In place of enlivening his patron with the constant fire of wit, or the cheerful rattle of his quarter-staff on the heads of his relations and acquaintance, here was that beaming Punch, utterly devoid of spine, all slack and drooping in a dark box, with his legs doubled up round his neck, and not one of his social qualities remaining. Mr Codlin trudged heavily on, exchanging a word or two at intervals with Short, and stopping to rest and growl occasionally. Short led the way, with the flat box, the private luggage, which was not extensive, tied up in a bundle, and a brazen trumpet slung from his shoulder-blade. Nell and her grandfather walked next to him on either hand, and Thomas Codlin brought up the rear. When they came to any town or village, or even to a detached house of good appearance, Short blew a blast upon the brazen trumpet, and carolled a fragment of a song in that hilarious tone common to Punches and their consorts. If people hurried to the windows, Mr Codlin pitched the temple, and hastily unfurling the drapery and concealing Short therewith, flourished hysterically on the pipes, and performed an air. Then the entertainment began as soon as might be, Mr Codlin having the responsibility of deciding on its length, and of protracting or expediting the time for the hero's final triumph over the enemy of mankind, according as he judged that the after-crop of halfpence would be plentiful or scant. When it had been gathered in to the last farthing, he resumed his load, and on they went again. Sometimes they played out the toll across a bridge or ferry, and once exhibited by particular desire at a turnpike, where the collector, being drunk in his solitude, paid down a shilling to have it to himself. There was one small place of rich promise in which their hopes were blighted, for a favourite character in the play, having gold lace upon his coat, and being a meddling wooden-headed fellow, was held to be a libel on the beadle, for which reason the authorities enforced a quick retreat. But they were generally well received, and seldom left a town without a troop of ragged children shouting at their heels. They made a long day's journey, despite these interruptions, and were yet upon the road when the moon was shining in the sky. Short beguiled the time with songs and jests, and made the best of everything that happened. Mr Codlin, on the other hand, cursed his fate, and all the hollow things of earth, but Punch especially, and limped along with the theatre on his back, a prey to the bitterest chagrin. They had stopped to rest beneath a finger-post where four roads met, and Mr Codlin, in his deep misanthropy, had let down the drapery and seated himself in the bottom of the show, invisible to mortal eyes and disdainful of the company of his fellow creatures, when two monstrous shadows were seen stalking towards them from a turning in the road by which they had come. The child was at first quite terrified by the sight of these gaunt giants, for such they looked as they advanced with lofty strides beneath the shadow of the trees. But Short, telling her there was nothing to fear, blew a blast upon the trumpet, which was answered by a cheerful shout. "It's Grinder's lot, an't it?" cried Mr Short in a loud key. "Yes," replied a couple of shrill voices. "Come on, then," said Short. "Let's have a look at you. I thought it was you." Thus invited, Grinder's lot approached with redoubled speed, and soon came up with the little party. Mr Grinder's company, familiarly termed a lot, consisted of a young gentleman and a young lady on stilts, and Mr Grinder himself, who used his natural legs for pedestrian purposes, and carried at his back a drum. The public costume of the young people was of the Highland kind, but the night being damp and cold, the young gentleman wore over his kilt a man's pea-jacket reaching to his ankles, and a glazed hat. The young lady, too, was muffled in an old cloth pelisse, and had a handkerchief tied about her head. Their Scotch bonnets, ornamented with plumes of jet-black feathers, Mr Grinder carried on his instrument. "Bound for the races, I see," said Mr Grinder, coming up out of breath. "So are we. How are you, Short?" With that they shook hands in a very friendly manner, The young people, being too high up for the ordinary salutations, saluted Short after their own fashion. The young gentleman twisted up his right stilt and patted him on the shoulder, and the young lady rattled her tambourine. 'Practice?' said Short, pointing to the stilts. 'No,' returned Grinder. 'He comes either to walking in 'em, or carrying of 'em, and they like walking in 'em best. It's very pleasant for the prospects. And which road are you taking? We go the nighest.'
'Why, the fact is,' said Short, 'that we are going the longest way, because then we could stop for the night, 1.5 miles on. But 3 or 4 mile gained to-night is so many saved to-morrow, and if you keep on, I think our best way is to do the same.'
'Where's your partner?' inquired Grinder.
'Here he is!' cried Mr Thomas Codlin, presenting his head and face in the proscenium of the stage, and exhibiting an expression of countenance not often seen there. 'And he'll see his partner boiled alive before he'll go on to-night. That's what he says.'
'Well, don't say such things as them in a spear which is dewoted to something pleasanter,' urged Short. 'Respect associations, Tommy, even if you do cut up rough.'
'Rough or smooth,' said Mr Codlin, beating his hand on the little footboard, where Punch, when suddenly struck with the symmetry of his legs and their capacity for silk stockings, is accustomed to exhibit them to popular admiration. 'Rough or smooth, I won't go further than the 1.5 to-night. I put up at the Jolly Sandboys and nowhere else. If you like to come there, come there. If you like to go on by yourself, go on by yourself, and do without me if you can.' So saying, Mr Codlin disappeared from the scene and immediately presented himself outside the theatre, took it on his shoulders at a jerk, and made off with most remarkable agility. Any further controversy being now out of the question, Short was fain to part with Mr Grinder and his pupils, and to follow his morose companion. After lingering at the finger-post for a few minutes to see the stilts frisking away in the moonlight, and the bearer of the drum toiling slowly after them, he blew a few notes upon the trumpet as a parting salute, and hastened with all speed to follow Mr Codlin. With this view he gave his unoccupied hand to Nell, and bidding her be of good cheer, as they would soon be at the end of their journey for that night, and stimulating the old man with a similar assurance, led them at a pretty swift pace towards their destinations, which he was the less unwilling to make for, as the moon was now overcast, and the clouds were threatening rain. End of chapter 17. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 18. The Jolly Sandboys was a small roadside inn of pretty ancient date, with a sign representing 3 sandboys, increasing their jollity with as many jugs of ale and bags of gold, creaking and swinging on its post on the opposite side of the road. As the travellers had observed that day, many indications of their drawing nearer and nearer to the race town, such as gipsy camps, carts laden with gambling booths and their appurtenances, itinerant showmen of various kinds, and beggars and trampers of every degree, all wending their way in the same direction. Mr Codlin was fearful of finding the accommodations forestalled. This fear increasing as he diminished the distance between himself and the hostelry, he quickened his pace, and notwithstanding the burden he had to carry, maintained a round trot until he reached the threshold. Here he had the gratification of finding that his fears were without foundation, for the landlord was leaning against the doorpost, looking lazily at the rain, which had by this time begun to descend heavily, and no tinkling of cracked bell, nor boisterous shout, nor noisy chorus gave note of company within. 'All alone?' said Mr Codlin, putting down his burden and wiping his forehead. 'All alone as yet,' rejoined the landlord, glancing at the sky, 'but we shall have more company to-night, I expect. Here,
One of you boys carry that show into the barn. Make haste in out of the wet, Tom. When it came on to rain, I told 'em to make the fire up, and there's a glorious blaze in the kitchen, I can tell you.' Mr Codlin followed with a willing mind, and soon found that the landlord had not commended his preparations without good reason. A mighty fire was blazing on the hearth, and roaring up the wide chimney with a cheerful sound, which a large iron cauldron, bubbling and simmering in the heat, lent its pleasant aid to swell. There was a deep, red, ruddy blush upon the room, and when the landlord stirred the fire, sending the flames skipping and leaping up, when he took off the lid of the iron pot, and there rushed out a savoury smell, while the bubbling sound grew deeper and more rich, and an unctuous steam came floating out, hanging in a delicious mist above their heads. When he did this, Mr Codlin's heart was touched. He sat down in the chimney corner and smiled. Mr Codlin sat smiling in the chimney corner, eyeing the landlord as with a roguish look he held the cover in his hand, and, feigning that his doing so was needful to the welfare of the cookery, suffered the delightful steam to tickle the nostrils of his guest. The glow of the fire was upon the landlord's bald head, and upon his twinkling eye, and upon his watering mouth, and upon his pimpled face, and upon his round fat figure. Mr Codlin drew his sleeve across his lips, and said in a murmuring voice, "What is it?" "It's a stew of tripe," said the landlord, smacking his lips, "and cow heel," smacking them again, "and bacon," smacking them once more, "and steak," smacking them for the 4th time, "and peas, cauliflowers, new potatoes, and sparrow grass, all working up together in one delicious gravy." Having come to the climax, he smacked his lips a great many times, and having a long hearty sniff of the fragrance that was hovering about, put on the cover again with the air of one whose toils on earth were over. "At what time will it be ready?" asked Mr Codlin faintly. "It will be done to a turn," said the landlord, looking up to the clock, and the very clock had a colour in its fat white face, and looked a clock for jolly sandboys to consult. "It will be done to a turn at 22 minutes before 11. "Then," said Mr Codlin, "fetch me a pint of warm ale, and don't let nobody bring into the room even so much as a biscuit till the time arrives." Nodding his approval of this decisive and manly course of procedure, the landlord retired to draw the beer, and presently returning with it, applied himself to warm the same in a small tin vessel shaped funnel-wise, for the convenience of sticking it far down in the fire and getting at the bright places. This was soon done, and he handed it over to Mr Codlin with that creamy froth upon the surface which is one of the happy circumstances attendant on mulled malt. Greatly softened by this soothing beverage, Mr Codlin now bethought him of his companions, and acquainted mine host of the Sandboys that their arrival might be shortly looked for. The rain was rattling against the windows and pouring down in torrents, and such was Mr Codlin's extreme amiability of mind, that he more than once expressed his earnest hope that they would not be so foolish as to get wet. At length they arrived, drenched with the rain, and presenting a most miserable appearance, notwithstanding that Short had sheltered the child as well as he could under the skirts of his own coat, and they were nearly breathless from the haste they had made. But their steps were no sooner heard upon the road than the landlord, who had been at the outer door anxiously watching for their coming, rushed into the kitchen and took the cover off. The effect was electrical. They all came in with smiling faces, though the wet was dripping from their clothes upon the floor, and Short's first remark was, "What a delicious smell!" It is not very difficult to forget rain and mud by the side of a cheerful fire and in a bright room,
They were furnished with slippers and such dry garments as the house of their own bundles afforded, and ensconcing themselves, as Mr Codlin had already done, in the warm chimney corner, soon forgot their late troubles, or only remembered them as enhancing the delights of the present time. Overpowered by the warmth and comfort and the fatigue they had undergone, Nelly and the old man had not long taken their seats here, when they fell asleep. 'Who are they?' whispered the landlord. Short shook his head, and wished he knew himself. 'Don't you know?' asked the host, turning to Mr Codlin. 'Not I,' he replied. 'They're no good, I suppose.'
'They're no harm,' said Short. 'Depend upon that. I'll tell you what, it's plain that the old man an't in his right mind.'
'If you haven't got anything newer than that to say,' growled Mr Codlin, glancing at the clock, 'you'd better let us fix our minds upon the supper, and not disturb us.'
'Hear me out, won't you?' retorted his friend. 'It's very plain to me, besides, that they're not used to this way of life. Don't tell me that that handsome child has been in the habit of prowling about as she's done these last 2 or 3 days. I know better.'
'Well, who does tell you she has?' growled Mr Codlin, again glancing at the clock, and from it to the cauldron. 'Can't you think of anything more suitable to present circumstances than saying things and then contradicting them?'
'I wish somebody would give you your supper,' returned Short, 'or there'll be no peace till you've got it. Have you seen how anxious the old man is to get on? Always wanting to be further away, further away. Have you seen that?'
'Ah! What then?' muttered Thomas Codlin.
'This then,' said Short. 'He has given his friends the slip. Mind what I say, he has given his friends the slip, and persuaded this delicate young creature, all along of her fondness for him, to be his guide and travelling companion, whereto he knows no more than the man in the moon. Now, I'm not a-going to stand that.'
'You're not a-going to stand that?' cried Mr Codlin, glancing at the clock again, and pulling his hair with both hands in a kind of frenzy, but whether occasioned by his companion's observation or the tardy pace of time, it was difficult to determine. 'Here's a world to live in!'
'I,' repeated Short emphatically and slowly, 'am not a-going to stand it. I'm not a-going to see this fair young child a-falling into bad hands, and getting among people that she's no more fit for than they are to get among angels as their ordinary chums. Therefore, when they develop an intention of parting company from us, I shall take measures for detaining of 'em, and restoring them to their friends, who, I dare say, have had their disconsolation pasted up on every wall in London by this time.'
'Short,' said Mr Codlin, who, with his head upon his hands and his elbows on his knees, had been shaking himself impatiently from side to side up to this point, and occasionally stamping on the ground, but who now looked up with eager eyes, 'it's possible that there may be uncommon good sense in what you've said. If there is, and there should be a reward, Short, remember that we're partners in everything.' His companion had only time to nod a brief assent to this position, for the child awoke at the instant. They had drawn close together during the previous whispering, and now hastily separated, and were rather awkwardly endeavouring to exchange some casual remarks in their usual tone, when strange footsteps were heard without, and fresh company entered. These were no other than 4 very dismal dogs, who came pattering in one after the other, headed by an old bandy dog of particularly mournful aspect, who, stopping when the last of his followers had got as far as the door, erected himself upon his hind legs and looked round at his companions, who immediately stood upon their hind legs in a grave and melancholy row. Nor was this the only remarkable circumstance about these dogs, for each of them wore a kind of little coat of some gaudy colour, trimmed with tarnished spangles, and one of them had a cap upon his head, tied very carefully under his chin, which had fallen down upon his nose, and completely obscured one eye.
Add to this that the gaudy coats were all wet through and discoloured with rain, and that the wearers were splashed and dirty, and some idea may be formed of the unusual appearance of these new visitors to the Jolly Sandboys. Neither Short nor the landlord nor Thomas Codlin, however, was in the least surprised, merely remarking that these were Jerry's dogs, and that Jerry could not be far behind. So there the dogs stood, patiently winking and gaping and looking extremely hard at the boiling pot, until Jerry himself appeared, when they all dropped down at once and walked about the room in their natural manner. This posture, it must be confessed, did not much improve their appearance, as their own personal tails and their coat tails, both capital things in their way, did not agree together. Jerry, the manager of these dancing dogs, was a tall black-whiskered man in a velveteen coat, who seemed well known to the landlord and his guests, and accosted them with great cordiality. Disencumbering himself of a barrel organ which he placed upon a chair, and retaining in his hand a small whip wherewith to awe his company of comedians, he came up to the fire to dry himself, and entered into conversation.
'Your people don't usually travel in character, do they?' said Short, pointing to the dresses of the dogs. 'It must come expensive if they do.'
'No,' replied Jerry. 'No, it's not the custom with us. But we've been playing a little on the road today, and we came out with a new wardrobe at the races, so I didn't think it worth while to stop to undress. Down, Pedro!' This was addressed to the dog with the cap on, who, being a new member of the company and not quite certain of his duty, kept his unobscured eye anxiously on his master, and was perpetually starting upon his hind legs when there was no occasion, and falling down again. 'I've got an animal here,' said Jerry, putting his hand into the capacious pocket of his coat, and diving into one corner as if he were feeling for a small orange or an apple or some such article. 'An animal here, what I think you know something of, Short.'
'Ah!' cried Short. 'Let's have a look at him.'
'Here he is,' said Jerry, producing a little terrier from his pocket. 'He was once a Toby of yours, warn't he?' In some versions of the great drama of Punch there is a small dog, a modern innovation, supposed to be the private property of that gentleman, whose name is always Toby. This Toby has been stolen in youth from another gentleman, and fraudulently sold to the confiding hero, who, having no guile himself, has no suspicion that it lurks in others. But Toby, entertaining a grateful recollection of his old master, and scorning to attach himself to any new patrons, not only refuses to smoke a pipe at the bidding of Punch, but to mark his old fidelity more strongly, seizes him by the nose, and wrings the same with violence, at which instance of canine attachment the spectators are deeply affected. This was the character which the little terrier in question had once sustained. If there had been any doubt upon the subject, he would speedily have resolved it by his conduct. For not only did he, on seeing Short, give the strongest tokens of recognition, but catching sight of the flat box, he barked so furiously at the pasteboard nose, which he knew was inside, that his master was obliged to gather him up and put him into his pocket again, to the great relief of the whole company. The landlord now busied himself in laying the cloth, in which process Mr Codlin obligingly assisted by setting forth his own knife and fork in the most convenient place, and establishing himself behind them. When everything was ready, the landlord took off the cover for the last time, and then indeed there burst forth such a goodly promise of supper, that if he had offered to put it on again, or had hinted at postponement, he would certainly have been sacrificed on his own hearth. However, he did nothing of the kind, but instead thereof assisted a stout servant girl in turning the contents of the cauldron into a large tureen, a proceeding which the dogs, proof against various hot splashes which fell upon their noses, watched with terrible eagerness. At length the dish was lifted on the table, and mugs of ale having been previously set round, little Nell ventured to say grace, and supper began. At this juncture the poor dogs were standing on their hind legs, quite surprisingly. The child, having pity on them, was about to cast some morsels of food to them before she tasted it herself, hungry though she was, when their master interposed. 'No, my dear, no. Not an atom from anybody's hand but mine, if you please. That dog,' said Jerry, pointing out the old leader of the troop, and speaking in a terrible voice,
lost a halfpenny to-day. He goes without his supper.' The unfortunate creature dropped upon his forelegs directly, wagged his tail, and looked imploringly at his master. 'You must be more careful, sir,' said Jerry, walking coolly to the chair where he had placed the organ and setting the stop. 'Come here. Now, sir, you play away at that while we have supper, and leave off if you dare.' The dog immediately began to grind most mournful music. His master, having shown him the whip, resumed his seat and called up the others, who, at his directions, formed in a row, standing upright as a file of soldiers. 'Now, gentlemen,' said Jerry, looking at them attentively, 'the dog whose name's called eats. The dogs whose names an't called keep quiet. Carlo.' The lucky individual whose name was called snapped up the morsel thrown towards him, but none of the others moved a muscle. In this manner they were fed at the discretion of their master. Meanwhile the dog in disgrace ground hard at the organ, sometimes in quick time, sometimes in slow, but never leaving off for an instant. When the knives and forks rattled very much, or any of his fellows got an unusually large piece of fat, he accompanied the music with a short howl, but he immediately checked it on his master looking round, and applied himself with increased diligence to the old hundredth. End of chapter 18. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 19. Supper was not yet over when there arrived at the Jolly Sandboys 2 more travellers bound for the same haven as the rest, who had been walking in the rain for some hours, and came in shining and heavy with water. One of these was the proprietor of a giant, and a little lady without legs or arms, who had jogged forward in a van. The other, a silent gentleman, who earned his living by showing tricks upon the cards, and who had rather deranged the natural expression of his countenance by putting small leaden lozenges into his eyes and bringing them out at his mouth, which was one of his professional accomplishments. The name of the first of these newcomers was Vuffin. The other, probably as a pleasant satire upon his ugliness, was called Sweet William. To render them as comfortable as he could, the landlord bestirred himself nimbly, and in a very short time both gentlemen were perfectly at their ease. 'How's the giant?' said Short, when they all sat smoking round the fire. 'Rather weak upon his legs,' returned Mr Vuffin. 'I begin to be afraid he's going at the knees.' 'That's a bad look-out,' said Short. 'Aye, bad indeed,' replied Mr Vuffin, contemplating the fire with a sigh. 'Once get a giant shaky upon his legs, and the public care no more about him than they do for a dead cabbage stalk.' 'What becomes of old giants?' said Short, turning to him again after a little reflection. 'They're usually kept in caravans to wait upon the dwarfs,' said Mr Vuffin. 'The maintaining of 'em must come expensive when they can't be shown, eh?' remarked Short, eyeing him doubtfully. 'It's better that than letting him go upon the parish or about the streets,' said Mr Vuffin. 'Once make a giant common, and giants will never draw again. Look at wooden legs. If there was only one man with a wooden leg, what a property he'd be!' 'So he would,' observed the landlord and Short both together. 'That's very true.' 'Instead of which,' pursued Mr Vuffin, 'if you was to advertise Shakespeare played entirely by wooden legs, it's my belief you wouldn't draw a sixpence.' 'I don't suppose you would,' said Short, and the landlord said so too. 'This shows, you see,'
said Mr Vuffin, waving his pipe with an argumentative air,
"this shows the policy of keeping the used-up giants still in the caravans, where they get food and lodging for nothing all their lives, and in general very glad they are to stop there. There was one giant, a black 'un, as left his caravan some year ago and took to carrying coach bills about London, making himself as cheap as crossing sweepers. He died. I make no insinuation against anybody in particular," said Mr Vuffin, looking solemnly around, "but he was ruining the trade, and he died."
The landlord drew his breath hard, and looked at the owner of the dogs, who nodded and said gruffly that he remembered.
"I know you do, Jerry," said Mr Vuffin with profound meaning. "I know you remember it, Jerry, and the universal opinion was that it served him right. Why, I remember the time when old Maunders has had 23 ones. I remember the time when old Maunders had in his cottage in Spa Fields in the winter time, when the season was over, 8 male and female dwarfs sitting down to dinner every day, who was waited on by 8 old giants in green coats, red smalls, blue cotton stockings, and high-lows. And there was one dwarf as had grown elderly and vicious, whenever his giant wasn't quick enough to please him, used to stick pins in his legs, not being able to reach up any higher. I know that's a fact, for Maunders told it me himself."
"What about the dwarfs when they get old?" inquired the landlord.
"The older a dwarf is, the better worth he is," returned Mr Vuffin. "A grey-headed dwarf, well wrinkled, is beyond all suspicion. But a giant weak in the legs and not standing upright, keep him in the caravan, but never show him, for any persuasion that can be offered."
While Mr Vuffin and his 2 friends smoked their pipes and beguiled the time with such conversation as this, the silent gentleman sat in a warm corner, swallowing, or seeming to swallow, 6-pennyworth of halfpence for practice, balancing a feather upon his nose, and rehearsing other feats of dexterity of that kind, without paying any regard whatever to the company, who in their turn left him utterly unnoticed. At length the weary child prevailed upon her grandfather to retire, and they withdrew, leaving the company yet seated round the fire, and the dogs fast asleep at a humble distance. After bidding the old man good night, Nell retired to her poor garret, but had scarcely closed the door when it was gently tapped at. She opened it directly, and was a little startled by the sight of Mr Thomas Codlin, whom she had left, to all appearance, fast asleep downstairs.
"What is the matter?"
said the child.
"Nothing's the matter, my dear," returned her visitor. "I'm your friend. Perhaps you haven't thought so, but it's me that's your friend, not him."
"Not who?" the child inquired.
"Short, my dear. I tell you what," said Codlin, "for all his having a kind of way with him that you be very apt to like, I'm the real open-hearted man. I mayn't look it, but I am indeed." The child began to be alarmed, considering that the ale had taken effect upon Mr Codlin, and that this commendation of himself was the consequence. "Short's very well, and seems kind," resumed the misanthrope, "but he overdoes it. Now I don't."
Certainly, if there were any fault in Mr Codlin's usual deportment, it was that he rather underdid his kindness to those about him than overdid it. But the child was puzzled, and could not tell what to say.
"Take my advice," said Codlin. "Don't ask me why, but take it. As long as you travel with us, keep as near me as you can. Don't offer to leave us, not on any account, but always stick to me and say that I'm your friend. Will you bear that in mind, my dear, and always say that it was me that was your friend?"
Say so where, and when?' inquired the child innocently. 'Oh, nowhere in particular,' replied Codlin, a little put out, as it seemed, by the question. 'I'm only anxious that you should think me so, and do me justice. You can't think what an interest I have in you. Why didn't you tell me your little history, that about you and the poor old gentleman? I'm the best adviser that ever was, and so interested in you, so much more interested than Short. I think they're breaking up downstairs. You needn't tell Short, you know, that we've had this little talk together. God bless you. Recollect the friend. Codlin's the friend, not Short. Short's very well as far as he goes, but the real friend is Codlin, not Short.' Eking out these professions with a number of benevolent and protecting looks and great fervour of manner, Thomas Codlin stole away on tiptoe, leaving the child in a state of extreme surprise. She was still ruminating upon his curious behaviour, when the floor of the crazy stairs and landing cracked beneath the tread of the other travellers who were passing to their beds. When they had all passed, and the sound of their footsteps had died away, one of them returned, and after a little hesitation and rustling in the passage, as if he were doubtful what door to knock at hers. 'Yes,' said the child from within. 'It's me, Short,' a voice called through the keyhole. 'I only wanted to say that we must be off early to-morrow morning, my dear, because unless we get the start of the dogs and the conjurer, the villagers won't be worth a penny. You'll be sure to be stirring early and go with us. I'll call you.' The child answered in the affirmative, and returning his good night, heard him creep away. She felt some uneasiness at the anxiety of these men, increased by the recollection of their whispering together downstairs and their slight confusion when she awoke, nor was she quite free from a misgiving that they were not the fittest companions she could have stumbled on. Her uneasiness, however, was nothing weighed against her fatigue, and she soon forgot it in sleep. Very early next morning, Short fulfilled his promise, and knocking softly at her door, entreated that she would get up directly, as the proprietor of the dogs was still snoring, and if they lost no time they might get a good deal in advance both of him and the conjurer, who was talking in his sleep, and from what he could be heard to say, appeared to be balancing a donkey in his dreams. She started from her bed without delay, and roused the old man with so much expedition that they were both ready as soon as Short himself, to that gentleman's unspeakable gratification and relief. After a very unceremonious and scrambling breakfast, of which the staple commodities were bacon and bread and beer, they took leave of the landlord and issued from the door of the Jolly Sandboys. The morning was fine and warm, the ground cool to the feet after the late rain, the hedges gayer and more green, the air clear, and everything fresh and healthful. Surrounded by these influences, they walked on pleasantly enough. They had not gone very far when the child was again struck by the altered behaviour of Mr Thomas Codlin, who, instead of plodding on sulkily by himself, as he had heretofore done, kept close to her, and when he had an opportunity of looking at her unseen by his companion, warned her by certain wry faces and jerks of the head not to put any trust in Short, but to reserve all confidences for Codlin. Neither did he confine himself to looks and gestures, for when she and her grandfather were walking on beside the aforesaid Short, and that little man was talking with his accustomed cheerfulness on a variety of indifferent subjects, Thomas Codlin testified his jealousy and distrust by following close at her heels, and occasionally admonishing her ankles with the legs of the theatre in a very abrupt and painful manner. All these proceedings naturally made the child more watchful and suspicious, and she soon observed that whenever they halted to perform outside a village ale-house or other place, Mr Codlin, while he went through his share of the entertainments, kept his eye steadily upon her and the old man, or with a show of great friendship and consideration invited the latter to lean upon his arm, and so held him tight until the representation was over, and they again went forward. Even Short seemed to change in this respect, and to mingle with his good nature something of a desire to keep them in safe custody. This increased the child's misgivings, and made her yet more anxious and uneasy.
Meanwhile they were drawing near the town where the races were to begin next day. For, from passing numerous groups of gipsies and trampers on the road, wending their way towards it, and straggling out from every byway and cross-country lane, they gradually fell into a stream of people, some walking by the side of covered carts, others with horses, others with donkeys, others toiling on with heavy loads upon their backs, but all tending to the same point. The public houses by the wayside, from being empty and noiseless as those in the remoter parts had been, now sent out boisterous shouts and clouds of smoke, and, from the misty windows, clusters of broad red faces looked down upon the road. On every piece of waste or common ground, some small gambler drove his noisy trade, and bellowed to the idle passers-by to stop and try their chance. The crowd grew thicker and more noisy. Gilt gingerbread in blanket stalls exposed its glories to the dust, and often a 4-horse carriage, dashing by, obscured all objects in the gritty cloud it raised, and left them stunned and blinded far behind. It was dark before they reached the town itself, and long indeed the few last miles had been. Here all was tumult and confusion. The streets were filled with throngs of people. Many strangers were there, it seemed, by the looks they cast about. The church bells rang out their noisy peals, and flags streamed from windows and housetops. In the large inn yards, waiters flitted to and fro, and ran against each other. Horses clattered on the uneven stones, carriage steps fell rattling down, and sickening smells from many dinners came in a heavy lukewarm breath upon the sense. In the smaller public houses, fiddles with all their might and main were squeaking out the tune to staggering feet. Drunken men, oblivious of the burden of their song, joined in a senseless howl, which drowned the tinkling of the feeble bell and made them savage for their drink. Vagabond groups assembled round the doors to see the stroller woman dance, and add their uproar to the shrill flageolet and deafening drum. Through this delirious scene, the child, frightened and repelled by all she saw, led on her bewildered charge, clinging close to her conductor, and trembling lest in the press she should be separated from him and left to find her way alone. Quickening their steps to get clear of all the roar and riot, they at length passed through the town and made for the racecourse, which was upon an open heath, situated on an eminence a full mile distant from its furthest bounds. Although there were many people here, none of the best favoured or best clad, busily erecting tents and driving stakes in the ground, and hurrying to and fro with dusty feet and many a grumbled oath. Although there were tired children cradled on heaps of straw between the wheels of carts, crying themselves to sleep, and poor lean horses and donkeys just turned loose, grazing among the men and women, and pots and kettles and half-lighted fires, and ends of candles flaring and wasting in the air, for all this, the child felt it an escape from the town, and drew her breath more freely. After a scanty supper, the purchase of which reduced her little stock so low that she had only a few halfpence with which to buy a breakfast on the morrow, she and the old man lay down to rest in a corner of a tent, and slept, despite the busy preparations that were going on around them all night long. And now they had come to the time when they must beg their bread. Soon after sunrise in the morning she stole out from the tent, and rambling into some fields at a short distance, plucked a few wild roses and such humble flowers, purposing to make them into little nosegays and offer them to the ladies in the carriages when the company arrived. Her thoughts were not idle while she was thus employed. When she returned and was seated beside the old man in one corner of the tent, tying her flowers together, while the two men lay dozing in another corner, she plucked him by the sleeve, and slightly glancing towards them, said in a low voice, "Grandfather, don't look at those I talk of, and don't seem as if I spoke of anything but what I am about. What was that you told me before we left the old house? That if they knew what we were going to do, they would say that you were mad, and part us?" The old man turned to her with an aspect of wild terror, but she checked him by a look, and bidding him hold some flowers while she tied them up, and so bringing her lips closer to his ear, said, "I know that was what you told me. You needn't speak, dear. I recollect it very well.
It was not likely that I should forget it. Grandfather, these men suspect that we have secretly left our friends, and mean to carry us before some gentleman and have us taken care of and sent back. If you let your hand tremble so, we can never get away from them. But if you're only quiet now, we shall do so easily.'
'How?' muttered the old man. 'Dear Nelly, how? They will shut me up in a stone room, dark and cold, and chain me up to the wall, Nell, flog me with whips, and never let me see thee more.'
'You're trembling again,' said the child. 'Keep close to me all day. Never mind them. Don't look at them, but me. I shall find a time when we can steal away. When I do, mind you come with me, and do not stop or speak a word. Hush! That's all.'
'Halloa! What are you up to, my dear?' said Mr Codlin, raising his head and yawning. Then, observing that his companion was fast asleep, he added in an earnest whisper, 'Codlin's the friend, remember, not Short.'
'Making some nosegays,' the child replied. 'I'm going to try and sell some these 3 days of the races. Will you have one? As a present, I mean.'
Mr Codlin would have risen to receive it, but the child hurried towards him and placed it in his hand. He stuck it in his buttonhole with an air of ineffable complacency for a misanthrope, and leering exultingly at the unconscious Short, muttered as he laid himself down again, 'Tom Codlin's the friend, by God!' As the morning wore on, the tents assumed a gayer and more brilliant appearance, and long lines of carriages came rolling softly on the turf. Men who had lounged about all night in smock frocks and leather leggings, came out in silken vests and hats and plumes, as jugglers or mountebanks, or in gorgeous liveries as soft-spoken servants at gambling booths, or in sturdy yeoman dress as decoys at unlawful games. Black-eyed gipsy girls, hooded in showy handkerchiefs, sallied forth to tell fortunes, and pale slender women with consumptive faces lingered upon the footsteps of ventriloquists and conjurers, and counted the sixpences with anxious eyes long before they were gained. As many of the children as could be kept within bounds were stowed away, with all the other signs of dirt and poverty, among the donkeys, carts, and horses, and as many as could not be thus disposed of ran in and out in all intricate spots, crept between people's legs and carriage wheels, and came forth unharmed from under horses' hoofs. The dancing dogs, the stilts, the little lady and the tall man, and all the other attractions, with organs out of number and bands innumerable, emerged from the holes and corners in which they had passed the night, and flourished boldly in the sun. Along the uncleared course, Short led his party, sounding the brazen trumpet and revelling in the voice of Punch, and at his heels went Thomas Codlin, bearing the show as usual, and keeping his eye on Nelly and her grandfather as they rather lingered in the rear. The child bore upon her arm the little basket with her flowers, and sometimes stopped with timid and modest looks to offer them at some gay carriage. But alas, there were many bolder beggars there, gipsies who promised husbands, and other adepts in their trade, and although some ladies smiled gently as they shook their heads, and others cried to the gentleman beside them, 'See what a pretty face!' they let the pretty face pass on, and never thought that it looked tired or hungry. There was but one lady who seemed to understand the child, and she was one who sat alone in a handsome carriage, while 2 young men in dashing clothes, who had just dismounted from it, talked and laughed loudly at a little distance, appearing to forget her quite. There were many ladies all around, but they turned their backs, or looked another way, or at the 2 young men, not unfavourably at them, and left her to herself. She motioned away a gipsy woman, urgent to tell her fortune, saying that it was told already, and had been for some years, but called the child towards her, and taking her flowers, put money into her trembling hand, and bade her go home, and keep at home for God's sake. Many a time they went up and down those long, long lines, seeing everything but the horses in the race. When the bell rang to clear the course, going back to rest among the carts and donkeys, and not coming out again until the heat was over. Many a time, too, was Punch displayed in the full zenith of his humour, but all this while the eye of Thomas Codlin was upon them, and to escape without notice was impracticable. At length, late in the day, Mr Codlin pitched the show in a convenient spot, and the spectators were soon in the very triumph of the scene. The child, sitting down with the old man close behind it, had been thinking how strange it was that horses, who were such fine honest creatures, should seem to make vagabonds of all the men they drew about them, when a loud laugh at some extemporaneous witticism of Mr Short's, having allusion to the circumstances of the day, roused her from her meditation and caused her to look around. If they were ever to get away unseen, that was the very moment. Short was plying the quarter-staves vigorously and knocking the characters in the fury of the combat against the sides of the show. The people were looking on with laughing faces, and Mr Codlin had relaxed into a grim smile as his roving eye detected hands going into waistcoat pockets and groping secretly for sixpences. If they were ever to get away unseen, that was the very moment. They seized it, and fled. They made a path through booths and carriages and throngs of people, and never once stopped to look behind. The bell was ringing, and the course was cleared by the time they reached the ropes, but they dashed across it insensible to the shouts and screeching that assailed them for breaking in upon its sanctity, and creeping under the brow of the hill at a quick pace, made for the open fields. End of chapter 19. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 20. Day after day, as he bent his steps homeward, returning from some new effort to procure employment, Kit raised his eyes to the window of the little room he had so much commended to the child, and hoped to see some indication of her presence. His own earnest wish, coupled with the assurance he had received from Quilp, filled him with the belief that she would yet arrive to claim the humble shelter he had offered, and from the death of each day's hope, another hope sprung up to live to-morrow. "I think they must certainly come to-morrow, eh, mother?" said Kit, laying aside his hat with a weary air, and sighing as he spoke. "They have been gone a week. They surely couldn't stop away more than a week, could they now?" The mother shook her head, and reminded him how often he had been disappointed already. "For the matter of that," said Kit, "you speak true and sensible enough, as you always do, mother. Still, I do consider that a week is quite long enough for 'em to be rambling about. Don't you say so?" "Quite long enough, Kit. Longer than enough. But they may not come back for all that." Kit was for a moment disposed to be vexed by this contradiction, and not the less so from having anticipated it in his own mind and knowing how just it was. But the impulse was only momentary, and the vexed look became a kind one before it had crossed the room. "Then what do you think, mother, has become of 'em? You don't think they've gone to sea, anyhow?" "Not gone for sailors, certainly," returned the mother with a smile. "But I can't help thinking that they have gone to some foreign country." "I say!" cried Kit with a rueful face. "Don't talk like that, mother." "I'm afraid they have, and that's the truth," she said. "It's the talk of all the neighbours, and there are some even that know of their having been seen on board ship, and can tell you the name of the place they've gone to, which is more than I can, my dear, for it's a very hard one." "I don't believe it," said Kit. "Not a word of it. A set of idle chatterboxes. How should they know?" "They may be wrong, of course," returned the mother. "I can't tell about that, though I don't think it's at all unlikely that they're in the right. For the talk is that the old gentleman had put by a little money that nobody knew of, not even that ugly little man you talked to me about. What's his name? Quilp. And that he and Miss Nell have gone to live abroad, where it can't be taken from them, and they will never be disturbed."
That don't seem very far out of the way now, do it?' Kit scratched his head mournfully, in reluctant admission that it did not, and clambering up to the old nail, took down the cage and set himself to clean it and to feed the bird. His thoughts reverting from this occupation to the little old gentleman who had given him the shilling, he suddenly recollected that that was the very day, nay, nearly the very hour, at which the little old gentleman had said he should be at the notary's house again. He no sooner remembered this than he hung up the cage with great precipitation, and hastily explaining the nature of his errand, went off at full speed to the appointed place. It was some 2 minutes after the time when he reached the spot, which was a considerable distance from his home, but by great good luck the little old gentleman had not yet arrived. At least there was no pony chaise to be seen, and it was not likely that he had come and gone again in so short a space. Greatly relieved to find that he was not too late, Kit leant against a lamp-post to take breath, and waited the advent of the pony and his charge. Sure enough, before long the pony came trotting round the corner of the street, looking as obstinate as pony might, and picking his steps as if he were spying about for the cleanest places, and would by no means dirty his feet or hurry himself inconveniently. Behind the pony sat the little old gentleman, and by the old gentleman's side sat the little old lady, carrying just such a nosegay as she had brought before. The old gentleman, the old lady, the pony, and the chaise came up the street in perfect unanimity, until they arrived within some 6 doors of the notary's house, when the pony, deceived by a brass plate beneath a tailor's knocker, came to a halt, and maintained by a sturdy silence that that was the house they wanted. 'Now, sir, will you ha' the goodness to go on? This is not the place,' said the old gentleman. The pony looked with great attention into a fire-plug which was near him, and appeared to be quite absorbed in contemplating it. 'Oh dear, such a naughty Whisker!' cried the old lady. 'After being so good too, and coming along so well. I'm quite ashamed of him. I don't know what we are to do with him, I really don't.' The pony, having thoroughly satisfied himself as to the nature and properties of the fire-plug, looked into the air after his old enemies the flies, and as there happened to be one of them tickling his ear at that moment, he shook his head and whisked his tail, after which he appeared full of thought, but quite comfortable and collected. The old gentleman, having exhausted his powers of persuasion, alighted to lead him, whereupon the pony, perhaps because he held this to be a sufficient concession, perhaps because he happened to catch sight of the other brass plate, or perhaps because he was in a spiteful humour, darted off with the old lady, and stopped at the right house, leaving the old gentleman to come panting on behind. It was then that Kit presented himself at the pony's head, and touched his hat with a smile. 'Why, bless me!' cried the old gentleman. 'The lad is here! My dear, do you see?' 'I said I'd be here, sir,' said Kit, patting Whisker's neck. 'I hope you've had a pleasant ride, sir. He's a very nice little pony.' 'My dear,' said the old gentleman, 'this is an uncommon lad, a good lad, I'm sure.' 'I'm sure he is,' rejoined the old lady, 'a very good lad, and I am sure he is a good son.' Kit acknowledged these expressions of confidence by touching his hat again and blushing very much. The old gentleman then handed the old lady out, and after looking at him with an approving smile, they went into the house, talking about him as they went, Kit could not help feeling. Presently Mr Witherden, smelling very hard at the nosegay, came to the window and looked at him, and after that Mr Abel came and looked at him, and after that the old gentleman and lady came and looked at him again, and after that they all came and looked at him together, which Kit, feeling very much embarrassed by, made a pretence of not observing. Therefore he patted the pony more and more, and this liberty the pony most handsomely permitted. The faces had not disappeared from the window many moments, when Mr Chuckster, in his official coat, and with his hat hanging on his head just as it happened to fall from its peg, appeared upon the pavement, and telling him he was wanted inside, bade him go in, and he would mind the chaise the while. In giving him this direction, Mr Chuckster remarked that he wished that he might be blessed if he could make out whether he, Kit, was precious raw or precious deep,
but intimated by a distrustful shake of the head that he inclined to the latter opinion. Kit entered the office in a great tremor, for he was not used to going among strange ladies and gentlemen, and the tin boxes and bundles of dusty papers had in his eyes an awful and venerable air. Mr Witherden, too, was a bustling gentleman who talked loud and fast, and all eyes were upon him, and he was very shabby. "Well, boy," said Mr Witherden, "you came to work out that shilling, not to get another, eh?"
"No, indeed, sir," replied Kit, taking courage to look up. "I never thought of such a thing."
"Father alive?" said the notary.
"Dead, sir."
"Mother?"
"Yes, sir." "Married again, eh?"
Kit made answer, not without some indignation, that she was a widow with 3 children, and that as to her marrying again, if the gentleman knew her, he wouldn't think of such a thing. At this reply Mr Witherden buried his nose in the flowers again, and whispered behind the nosegay to the old gentleman that he believed the lad was as honest a lad as need be. "Now," said Mr Garland, when they had made some further inquiries of him, "I am not going to give you anything."
"Thank you, sir,"
Kit replied, and quite seriously too, for this announcement seemed to free him from the suspicion which the notary had hinted. "But," resumed the old gentleman, "perhaps I may want to know something more about you. So, tell me where you live, and I'll put it down in my pocket-book." Kit told him, and the old gentleman wrote down the address with his pencil. He had scarcely done so, when there was a great uproar in the street, and the old lady, hurrying to the window, cried that Whisker had run away, upon which Kit darted out to the rescue, and the others followed. It seemed that Mr Chuckster had been standing with his hands in his pockets, looking carelessly at the pony, and occasionally insulting him with such admonitions as "Stand still," "Be quiet," "War," and the like, which by a pony of spirit cannot be borne. Consequently, the pony being deterred by no considerations of duty or obedience, and not having before him the slightest fear of the human eye, had at length started off, and was at that moment rattling down the street. Mr Chuckster, with his hat off and a pen behind his ear, hanging on in the rear of the chaise, and making futile attempts to draw it the other way, to the unspeakable admiration of all beholders. Even in running away, however, Whisker was perverse, for he had not gone very far when he suddenly stopped, and before assistance could be rendered, commenced backing at nearly as quick a pace as he had gone forward. By these means Mr Chuckster was pushed and hustled to the office again in a most inglorious manner, and arrived in a state of great exhaustion and discomfiture. The old lady then stepped into her seat, and Mr Abel, whom they had come to fetch, into his. The old gentleman, after reasoning with the pony on the extreme impropriety of his conduct, and making the best amends in his power to Mr Chuckster, took his place also, and they drove away, waving a farewell to the notary and his clerk, and more than once turning to nod kindly to Kit as he watched them from the road. End of chapter 20. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 21. Kit turned away, and very soon forgot the pony, and the chaise, and the little old lady, and the little old gentleman, and the little young gentleman to boot, in thinking what could have become of his late master and his lovely grandchild, who were the fountain-head of all his meditations. Still casting about for some plausible means of accounting for their non-appearance, and of persuading himself that they must soon return, he bent his steps towards home, intending to finish the task which the sudden recollection of his contract had interrupted, and then to sally forth once more to seek his fortune for the day. When he came to the corner of the court in which he lived, lo and behold, there was the pony again. Yes, there he was, looking more obstinate than ever, and alone in the chaise, keeping a steady watch upon his every wink, sat Mr Abel, who, lifting up his eyes by chance and seeing Kit pass by, nodded to him as though he would have nodded his head off. Kit wondered to see the pony again, so near his own home too, but it never occurred to him for what purpose the pony might have come there, or where the old lady and the old gentleman had gone, until he lifted the latch of the door, and walking in, found them seated in the room in conversation with his mother, at which unexpected sight he pulled off his hat and made his best bow in some confusion. 'We are here before you, you see, Christopher,' said Mr Garland, smiling.
'Yes, sir,'
said Kit, and as he said it, he looked towards his mother for an explanation of the visit.
'The gentleman's been kind enough, my dear,' she said in reply to this mute interrogation, 'to ask me whether you were in a good place, or in any place at all. And when I told him no, you were not in any, he was so good as to say that
we wanted a good lad in our house,' said the old gentleman and the old lady both together, 'and that perhaps we might think of it, if we found everything as we would wish it to be.'
As this thinking of it plainly meant the thinking of engaging Kit, he immediately partook of his mother's anxiety and fell into a great flutter. For the little old couple were very methodical and cautious, and asked so many questions that he began to be afraid there was no chance of his success.
'You see, my good woman,' said Mrs Garland to Kit's mother, 'that it's necessary to be very careful and particular in such a matter as this, for we're only 3 in family, and are very quiet regular folks, and it would be a sad thing if we made any kind of mistake, and found things different from what we hoped and expected.'
To this Kit's mother replied that certainly it was quite true, and quite right, and quite proper, and Heaven forbid that she should shrink, or have cause to shrink, from any inquiry into her character or that of her son, who was a very good son though she was his mother, in which respect she was bold to say he took after his father, who was not only a good son to his mother, but the best of husbands and the best of fathers besides, which Kit could and would corroborate, she knew, and so would little Jacob, and the baby likewise, if they were old enough, which unfortunately they were not, though, as they didn't know what a loss they had had, perhaps it was a great deal better that they should be as young as they were. And so Kit's mother wound up a long story by wiping her eyes with her apron and patting little Jacob's head, who was rocking the cradle and staring with all his might at the strange lady and gentleman. When Kit's mother had done speaking, the old lady struck in again, and said that she was quite sure she was a very honest and very respectable person, or she never would have expressed herself in that manner, and that certainly the appearance of the children and the cleanliness of the house deserved great praise and did her the utmost credit, whereat Kit's mother dropped a curtsy and became consoled. Then the good woman entered into a long and minute account of Kit's life and history from the earliest period down to that time, not omitting to make mention of his miraculous fall out of a back parlour window when an infant of tender years, or his uncommon sufferings in a state of measles, which were illustrated by correct imitations of the plaintive manner in which he called for toast and water day and night, and said, "Don't cry, mother, I shall soon be better." For proof of which statements reference was made to Mrs Green, lodger, at the cheesemonger's round the corner, and divers other ladies and gentlemen in various parts of England and Wales, and one Mr Brown who was supposed to be then a corporal in the East Indies, and who could of course be found with very little trouble, within whose personal knowledge the circumstances had occurred. This narration ended, Mr Garland put some questions to Kit respecting his qualifications and general acquirements, while Mrs Garland noticed the children, and hearing from Kit's mother certain remarkable circumstances which had attended the birth of each, related certain other remarkable circumstances which had attended the birth of her own son, Mr Abel, from which it appeared that both Kit's mother and herself had been, above and beyond all other women of what condition or age soever, peculiarly hemmed in with perils and dangers. Lastly, inquiry was made into the nature and extent of Kit's wardrobe, and a small advance being made to improve the same, he was formally hired at an annual income of £6, over and above his board and lodging, by Mr and Mrs Garland of Abel Cottage, Finchley. It would be difficult to say which party appeared most pleased with this arrangement, the conclusion of which was hailed with nothing but pleasant looks and cheerful smiles on both sides. It was settled that Kit should repair to his new abode on the next day but one, in the morning, and finally the little old couple, after bestowing a bright half-crown on little Jacob and another on the baby, took their leaves, being escorted as far as the street by their new attendant, who held the obdurate pony by the bridle while they took their seats, and saw them drive away with a lightened heart.
'Well, mother,' said Kit, hurrying back into the house, 'I think my fortune's about made now.'
'I should think it was indeed,' rejoined his mother.
£6 a year! Only think!'
'Ah!' said Kit, trying to maintain the gravity which the consideration of such a sum demanded, but grinning with delight in spite of himself. 'There's a property!' Kit drew a long breath when he had said this, and putting his hands deep into his pockets, as if there were 1 year's wages at least in each, looked at his mother as though he saw through her, and down an immense perspective of sovereigns beyond.
'Please God, we make such a lady of you for Sundays, mother, such a scholar of Jacob, such a child of the baby, such a room of the one upstairs. £6 a year!'
'Ahem!' croaked a strange voice. 'What's that about £6 a year? What about £6 a year?'
And as the voice made this inquiry, Daniel Quilp walked in, with Richard Swiveller at his heels.
'Who said he was to have £6 a year?'
said Quilp, looking sharply round.
'Did the old man say it, or did little Nell say it? And what's he to have it for, and where are they, eh?'
The good woman was so much alarmed by the sudden apparition of this unknown piece of ugliness, that she hastily caught the baby from its cradle, and retreated into the furthest corner of the room, while little Jacob, sitting upon his stool with his hands on his knees, looked full at him in a species of fascination, roaring lustily all the time. Richard Swiveller took an easy observation of the family over Mr Quilp's head, and Quilp himself, with his hands in his pockets, smiled in an exquisite enjoyment of the commotion he had occasioned.
'Don't be frightened, mistress,' said Quilp after a pause. 'Your son knows me. I don't eat babies. I don't like 'em. It'll be as well to stop that young screamer, though, in case I should be tempted to do him a mischief. Halloa, sir! Will you be quiet?'
Little Jacob stemmed the course of 2 tears which he was squeezing out of his eyes, and instantly subsided into a silent horror.
'Mind you don't break out again, you villain,' said Quilp, looking sternly at him, 'or I'll make faces at you, and throw you into fits, I will. Now, you, sir, why haven't you been to me as you promised?'
'What should I come for?' retorted Kit. 'I haven't any business with you, no more than you had with me.'
'Here, mistress,'
said Quilp, turning quickly away, and appealing from Kit to his mother.
'When did his old master come, or send here last? Is he here now? If not, where's he gone?'
'He has not been here at all,' she replied. 'I wish we knew where they have gone, for it would make my son a good deal easier in his mind, and me too. If you're the gentleman named Mr Quilp, I should have thought you'd have known, and so I told him only this very day.'
'Humph!' muttered Quilp, evidently disappointed to believe that this was true.
'That's what you tell this gentleman too, is it?'
'If the gentleman comes to ask the same question, I can't tell him anything else, sir. But I only wish I could, for our own sakes,'
was the reply. Quilp glanced at Richard Swiveller, and observed that having met him on the threshold, he assumed that he had come in search of some intelligence of the fugitives. He supposed he was right. 'Yes,' said Dick, 'that was the object of the present expedition. I fancied it possible, but let us go ring Fancy's Nell. I'll begin it.'
'You seem disappointed,'
observed Quilp.
'A baffler, sir, a baffler, that's all,'
returned Dick. 'I have entered upon a speculation which has proved a baffler, and a being of brightness and beauty will be offered up a sacrifice at Cheggs's altar. That's all, sir.' The dwarf eyed Richard with a sarcastic smile, but Richard, who had been taking a rather strong lunch with a friend, observed him not, and continued to deplore his fate with mournful and despondent looks. Quilp plainly discerned that there was some secret reason for this visit and his uncommon disappointment, and, in the hope that there might be means of mischief lurking beneath it, resolved to worm it out. He had no sooner adopted this resolution than he conveyed as much honesty into his face as it was capable of expressing, and sympathized with Mr Swiveller exceedingly.
'I am disappointed myself,' said Quilp, 'out of mere friendly feeling for them. But you have real reasons, private reasons I have no doubt, for your disappointment, and therefore it comes heavier than mine.'
'Why, of course it does,' Dick observed testily.
'Upon my word, I'm very sorry, very sorry. I'm rather cast down myself. As we are companions in adversity, shall we be companions in the surest way of forgetting it? If you had no particular business now to lead you in another direction,' urged Quilp, plucking him by the sleeve and looking slyly up into his face out of the corners of his eyes, 'there is a house by the waterside where they have some of the noblest skeedom, reputed to be smuggled, but that's between ourselves, that can be got in all the world. The landlord knows me. There's a little summer house overlooking the river, where we might take a glass of this delicious liquor with a whiff of the best tobacco. It's in this case, and of the rarest quality to my certain knowledge, and be perfectly snug and happy, could we possibly contrive it. Or is there any very particular engagement that peremptorily takes you another way, Mr Swiveller, eh?'
As the dwarf spoke, Dick's face relaxed into a compliant smile, and his brows slowly unbent. By the time he had finished, Dick was looking down at Quilp in the same sly manner as Quilp was looking up at him, and there remained nothing more to be done but to set out for the house in question. This they did straight away. The moment their backs were turned, little Jacob thawed, and resumed his crying from the point where Quilp had frozen him. The summer house, of which Mr Quilp had spoken, was a rugged wooden box, rotten and bare to see, which overhung the river's mud, and threatened to slide down into it. The tavern to which it belonged was a crazy building, sapped and undermined by the rats, and only upheld by great bars of wood which were reared against its walls, and had propped it up so long that even they were decaying and yielding with their load, and of a windy night might be heard to creak and crack as if the whole fabric were about to come toppling down. The house stood, if anything so old and feeble could be said to stand, on a piece of waste ground, blighted with the unwholesome smoke of factory chimneys, and echoing the clank of iron wheels and rush of troubled water. Its internal accommodations amply fulfilled the promise of the outside. The rooms were low and damp, the clammy walls were pierced with chinks and holes, the rotten floors had sunk from their level, the very beams started from their places and warned the timid stranger from their neighbourhood. To this inviting spot, entreating him to observe its beauties as they passed along, Mr Quilp led Richard Swiveller, and on the table of the summer house, scored deep with many a gallows and initial letter, there soon appeared a wooden keg, full of the vaunted liquor. Drawing it off into the glasses with the skill of a practised hand, and mixing it with about a third part of water, Mr Quilp assigned to Richard Swiveller his portion, and lighting his pipe from an end of a candle in a very old and battered lantern, drew himself together upon a seat and puffed away. 'Is it good?' said Quilp, as Richard Swiveller smacked his lips. 'Is it strong and fiery? Does it make you wink and choke, and your eyes water, and your breath come short, does it?' 'Does it?' cried Dick, throwing away part of the contents of his glass, and filling it up with water. 'Why, man, you don't mean to tell me that you drink such fire as this?' 'No,' rejoined Quilp, 'not drink it. Look here, and here, and here again. Not drink it.' As he spoke, Daniel Quilp drew off and drank 3 small glassfuls of the raw spirit, and then with a horrible grimace took a great many pulls at his pipe, and swallowing the smoke, discharged it in a heavy cloud from his nose. This feat accomplished, he drew himself together in his former position, and laughed excessively.
'Give us a toast!'
cried Quilp, rattling on the table in a dexterous manner with his fist and elbow alternately, in a kind of tune.
'A woman, a beauty. Let's have a beauty for our toast, and empty our glasses to the last drop. Her name, come!'
'If you want a name,' said Dick, 'here's Sophy Wackles.'
'Sophy Wackles!' screamed the dwarf. 'Miss Sophy Wackles, that is. Mrs Richard Swiveller that shall be. Shall be.
Ah!' said Dick. 'You might have said that a few weeks ago, but it won't do now, my buck. Immolating herself upon the shrine of Cheggs.'
'Poison Cheggs! Cut Cheggs' ears off!' rejoined Quilp. 'I won't hear of Cheggs. Her name is Swiveller, or nothing. I'll drink her health again, and her father's, and her mother's, and all her sisters and brothers. The glorious family of the Wackleses, all the Wackleses in one glass. Down with it to the dregs.'
'Well,' said Richard Swiveller, stopping short in the act of raising the glass to his lips, and looking at the dwarf in a species of stupor as he flourished his arms and legs about, 'you're a jolly fellow, but of all the jolly fellows I ever saw or heard of, you have the queerest and most extraordinary way with you. 'Pon my life, you have.' This candid declaration tended rather to increase than restrain Mr Quilp's eccentricity, and Richard Swiveller, astonished to see him in such a roistering vein, and drinking not a little himself for company, began imperceptibly to become more companionable and confiding, so that, being judiciously led on by Mr Quilp, he grew at last very confiding indeed. Having once got him into this mood, and knowing now the keynote to strike whenever he was at a loss, Daniel Quilp's task was comparatively an easy one, and he was soon in possession of the whole details of the scheme contrived between the easy Dick and his more designing friend.
'Stop!' said Quilp. 'That's the thing, that's the thing. It can be brought about. It shall be brought about. There's my hand upon it. I am your friend from this minute.'
'What? Do you think there's still a chance?' inquired Dick, in surprise at this encouragement.
'A chance?' echoed the dwarf. 'A certainty. Sophy Wackles may become a Cheggs, or anything else she likes, but not a Swiveller. Ho, you lucky dog! He's richer than any Jew alive. You're a made man. I see in you now nothing but Nelly's husband, rolling in gold and silver. I'll help you. It shall be done. Mind my words, it shall be done.'
'But how?' said Dick.
'There's plenty of time,' rejoined the dwarf, 'and it shall be done. We'll sit down and talk it over again all the way through. Fill your glass while I'm gone. I shall be back directly.
With these hasty words, Daniel Quilp withdrew into a dismantled skittle ground behind the public house, and, throwing himself upon the ground, actually screamed and rolled about in uncontrollable delight.
'Here's sport!' he cried. 'Sport ready to my hand, all invented and arranged, and only to be enjoyed. It was this shallow-pated fellow who made my bones ache t'other day, was it? It was his friend and fellow plotter, Mr Trent, that once made eyes at Mrs Quilp and leered and looked, was it? After labouring for 2 or 3 years in their precious scheme, to find that they've got a beggar at last, and one of them tied for life. He shall marry Nell. He shall have her.
And I'll be the first man when the knot's tied hard and fast to tell 'em what they've gained and what I've helped 'em to. Here will be a clearing of old scores. Here will be a time to remind 'em what a capital friend I was, and how I helped 'em to the heiress.
In the height of his ecstasy, Mr Quilp had like to have met with a disagreeable check, for rolling very near a broken dog kennel, there leapt forth a large fierce dog, who, but that his chain was of the shortest, would have given him a disagreeable salute. As it was, the dwarf remained upon his back in perfect safety, taunting the dog with hideous faces, and triumphing over him in his inability to advance another inch, though there were not a couple of feet between them.
Why don't you come and bite me? Why don't you come and tear me to pieces, you coward?
Said Quilp, hissing and worrying the animal till he was nearly mad.
You're afraid, you bully, you're afraid. You know you are.
The dog tore and strained at his chain with starting eyes and furious bark, but there the dwarf lay, snapping his fingers with gestures of defiance and contempt. When he had sufficiently recovered from his delight, he rose, and with his arms akimbo, achieved a kind of demon dance round the kennel, just without the limits of the chain, driving the dog quite wild. Having by this means composed his spirits and put himself in a pleasant train, he returned to his unsuspicious companion, whom he found looking at the tide with exceeding gravity, and thinking of that same gold and silver which Mr Quilp had mentioned. End of chapter 21.